Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on this occasion on our heritage.website. We also ask everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind, to make sure that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It's a nice courtesy for our speakers and for recording the event. Our program will, of course, be posted on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion is Derek Morgan. Derek serves as Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy here at Heritage. He previously served for 2 years as Chief of Staff to our former President Edwin J. Fulner. Before joining Heritage, he served in all 3 branches of the federal government, including as an environmental policy expert in the U.S. Senate and as a senior staffer for Vice President Dick Cheney. Please welcome Derek Morgan. Derek?
Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. I think you're in for a very exciting event and a fun lineup today. And that's true even though 4 of us are lawyers. And that's not really what you associate with lawyers ordinarily, but I think will be an exception today. You know, each year, one of my favorite public policy organizations, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, sends out little calendars that are meant for a desktop. Some of you may have seen them. And there's a cartoon for each month, basically. In one month, there was this drawing that depicted 2 hunter-gatherer types, you know, cavemen, who were sitting around talking. And I'm paraphrasing, but the conversation was something like this. I just don't understand. We get plenty of exercise, fresh air, and we eat only free-range animals. Yet we still die at age 30. And obviously, while made in jest, there's a grain of truth to that as well. You know, that's what makes these New Yorker-style cartoons that's what makes them work. But the fact is that life for many of us, you know, in terms of health and food and leisure and just overall quality of life, is much better now and incredibly richer in the modern era. We see that especially in developed countries, where human ingenuity, technology, and free markets are commonplace. And in fact, the environment's getting much cleaner in these developed economies, as we'll talk about a lot today. So if you want to think more about why this is so, I highly recommend the Heritage Foundation's very own. After all, that's what we do here. We do reports. But you'll see this Land of Liberty brochure, and it goes through some of the principles for why, for the American conservation ethic and why free market policies and conservative values work in the environmental space as well. In fact, they work better than the left's prescriptions. In fact, we have another book, I think there'll be some copies available at the end, that fleshes out those principles in terms of how you would apply those principles in areas as diverse as NEPA or the Clean Water Act and so forth. So I highly encourage you to pick that up. Well, let me get to introducing our panelists today. And again, I do apologize that we have 4 lawyers, but I think maybe we made up for that a little bit because one of us was raised on a cattle ranch. I'm not going to tell you who that is, but maybe you can guess. Or maybe they will reveal themselves in due course. First, we have Myron Abell. He is the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment, which is one of the most effective advocates for free market environmentalism. He also serves as executive director of Freedom Action and chairs the Cooler Heads Coalition, an ad hoc coalition of 28 nonprofit groups that question global warming alarmism and oppose energy rationing policies. The Business Insider commented that Myron Abell may be enemy number 1 to the current climate change community. So how does it feel to be on an enemies list? and then we'll hear from Darren and David. I'll introduce them now as well, Myron, if that's all right.
That's fine.
All right, Darren Back studies and writes about agriculture subsidies, property rights, environmental policy, food labeling, and related issues as the Heritage Foundation's research fellow in agriculture policy. Before joining us, he worked at the U.S. Chamber on regulatory reform and agriculture policy and land use policy at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. And he serves on the Federalist Society's Environmental Law and Property Rights Executive Committee. We also have David Schnarr with us. He's the General Counsel of the Energy and Environment Legal Institute and is also Director of the Center for Environmental Stewardship at the Thomas Jefferson Institute, which is Virginia's premier independent public policy foundation. He holds an appointment to the Chesapeake Bay Exceptions Review Commission of the Fairfax County, the largest urban county in the nation. That's at my home as well. Dr. Schnarr's honors include 4 gold and 4 bronze medals from the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Vice President's Hammer Award and multiple U.S. Department of Justice certificates of commendation. And last, we have Steve Malloy. who is the Director of External Policy and Strategy for Murray Energy Corporation, the largest privately owned U.S. coal company. Mr. Malloy has testified on risk assessment and Superfund before the U.S. Congress and has lectured before numerous organizations. He's authored several books, including the Amazon.com best-selling book, quote, Green Hell, How Environmentalists Plan to Control Your Life and What You Can Do to Stop Them. So, kind of a vague title there, right? Tell us what you really think. That's right. And so let's please welcome all our panelists, and we'll start with Myron. I'm not sure if I messed up your PowerPoint there.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Derek, and I want to thank Darren and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me today. Earth Day. The first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970, Lenin's birthday. The founder was Senator Gaylord Nelson, and he picked as the first coordinator a man named Dennis Hayes, who is in the foreground of that slide. He was a 20-some-year-old graduate student at the Kennedy School, originally from Washington State. He went to Stanford and studied, I think, political science or history. Now, at the 45th Earth Day, the Earth Day Network is still chaired by Dennis Hayes. So it's a lifetime commitment. He's also president of the Bullitt Foundation in Seattle. Now, here is a rather larger gathering from the early days. That's the first Earth Day in Philadelphia. And the speaker at that moment is Ira Einhorn, a famous new leftist who was involved in campaigns against the Vietnam War, for nuclear disarmament, for legalizing drugs, and for free love. And so he was a natural for the first Earth Day at Philadelphia. Now, in the 45 years since, it's gotten rather smaller. I was trying to find out what the Earth Day events were here in Washington, D.C., which is where the Earth Day Network is headquartered. It was very difficult. This is the best publicized event. The Earth Day Network's major event, and it's one of its 4 or 5 major events in the entire world, is at Union Station today. And as far as I can tell, they have one small corner of the main hall, and it's all NASA. NASA has about 30 people there passing out things and talking to school children and so on. So it's odd that Earth Day has come to this because, of course, the environmental movement is still going strong. So I checked the media. Nothing in the Washington Post today. Investor's Business Daily had a very good op-ed, which I made some copies of, which I will pass out. But the New York Times did have a full page. And this is the New York Times entire, they have Science Times today, a special energy section, not a word about Earth Day. They did have a full page on page A9. It's from Patron Tequila. This Earth Day, drink responsibly. So that's where we are. And I didn't have a slide, but here's Dennis Hayes today in front of the Bullitt Foundation building in Seattle, which he claims is the world's greenest building. So you may want to visit there sometime. Now, Darren already stole this slide. But, you know, the environmental movement started out with some very big mistaken assumptions. The first is that there was a state of nature where everything was great. And these two cavemen sum it up. Something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. The second mistake that they made was in the early days of the environmental movement that they thought that the Soviet Union was a Garden of Eden because it was not a capitalist economy. And they were really stunned when some of them visited in the early 70s and mid-70s, when they visited the Soviet Union and saw that it was a toxic wasteland, and they had a really hard time explaining it. And that's because they don't understand what creates environmental quality and improves the environment. And that is true up until this very day. So, for example, the limits to growth in the early 1970s said that we were running out of everything. And if you look at those spaghetti lines carefully, you will see that right about now, everything goes down. We run out of resources, births go down, population starts to go down, deaths go way up, food per capita goes down, and even pollution goes down as everybody dies off. So that's how wrong they were. In fact, we're not running out of anything. Here's just one example. We use a huge amount of oil globally every day, and yet proven reserves have not gone down, they've gone up. Now, they could go up a lot more, but it's not in the interests of oil companies to prove reserves too far into the future, because then the price of oil will go down. So, in fact, we're not running out of anything. Moreover, numerous World Bank studies have shown that there is a direct correlation between environmental quality and wealth in a society. And this is a stunning, you'll see that the United States is a little bit below the line, but the environmental standards that they use include some things that we wouldn't necessarily consider as part of environmental quality, such as we use a lot of fossil fuels which emit a lot of carbon dioxide, so that brings our score down. Now, there's also a very strong correlation between energy use and life expectancy. And the countries that don't have any energy are poor societies, and they don't live very long. So again, this is something that the environmental movement has a very hard time coming to terms with. In fact, they deny it. So I think other speakers are going to speak about this, but I just want to say that as all of these things have gone up, GDP, vehicle miles traveled, population, and energy consumption in the United States, aggregate air pollution emissions have gone way down. So that raises the question, why doesn't the environmental movement declare victory? And I pose that. I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, motives are involved, but they have succeeded. The air is clean. The water is clean. I don't have a graph, but maybe others do, on how much water quality has improved. Let's face it, in 1970, the environment was in terrible shape in this country. The air quality was terrible, not just in urban areas. Water quality in our major rivers was terrible, and a lot of our land was degraded. The first two have improved dramatically, and at this point, the environmental movement should congratulate itself, because they had a lot to do with it. And we should congratulate them and say, okay, thanks, so long. But we don't. Now, one of the things, and I'm almost done here, let me just give one other example of how things have been getting better. As CO2 emissions have gone up, atmospheric levels of CO2 have gone up, energy use has gone up, so has world grain yields. In fact, there's a direct correlation between atmospheric CO2 and grain production. So, the biggest problem remaining environmentally in the United States is land degradation. And the principal reason for that is something that the environmentalists support, which is that the federal government owns almost 30% of this country. And I'm a rural Westerner, and I'm not a lawyer, but I can attest from a lot of personal experience that the federal government is a terrible manager of the land. And of course, they want to manage private land too, through endangered species, invasive species, wetlands regulations, and other environmental regulations. So we have this huge, essentially socialized land base in the West, which is responsible for one environmental problem and disaster after another. It's a lot like the Soviet Union was, which the environmentalists thought and really never explained why it wasn't the Garden of Eden. They never came to terms with it. So, and the other problem is that the environmental movement has been extremely successful in convincing people that environmental quality is going down. Every year Gallup has a poll, and they ask a bunch of questions. It's worth looking at. The latest one in March, and they've been doing this for 20-some years, 50% of Americans think that environmental quality is getting worse, and only 42% think that it is getting better. Now, I think this is a problem for us. The environmental movement should have declared victory and said, things are great, we've solved our air quality problems, our water quality problems, and you should all be grateful to the environmental movement. But instead, they have somehow managed, and it's partly because they have vast resources and huge organizations and tremendous amounts of foundation funding. It's partly because the conservative movement has never really taken the measure of the environmental movement and taken it seriously and confronted it. But I would just leave you with this. This is a problem. We have much better environmental quality. The world is in a much, and particularly the United States, is in a flourishing condition, and yet Americans think environmental quality is getting better, worse. half of them think it's getting worse. So thank you.
Give me a sec. There are a bunch of slides here. Oops. Not a good idea to follow Myron. Never a good idea. I want to talk about air quality trends and answer the question of what are the trends in air quality? And the answer is the air is getting much cleaner. And I thought about ending the presentation at that, actually. I thought I'd save time to other important people. But as Myron said, the public doesn't seem, or a lot of people in the public don't seem to buy this conclusion. And then, as Myron said, in this recent Gallup survey, 50% of the respondents think the quality of the environment is getting worse. 55% rate the overall quality of the environment as fair or poor. Then focusing on air quality, 46% worry a great deal about air pollution. That's the highest number since 2001 when it was 48%. So it's unclear why this is happening. Certainly there are scare tactics out there. And even when air quality gets better, the way the EPA, we set up standards. And as the standards kind of get more stringent, your air quality could get better, but as you're not able to meet the standards, makes it look like the counties and the areas aren't doing as well. So it looks like the goalposts are constantly moving on local communities. All right, so there's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. There's 6 common pollutants, and what I want to do is just go through the 6 criteria pollutants: ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. And in particular, particulate matter, we're going to focus on PM 2.5, which is fine particles, and that's what the EPA is focusing on. And what I'm going to look at is the concentration levels of these different pollutants. And as you'll see, there's been incredible improvement since 1980. So if we look at lead, since 1980, there's been a 91% decrease with the mean concentration levels for lead. Carbon monoxide, 83% decline. So it's major declines. PM 2.5, now they only have measured PM 2.5 since 2000, because before 2000 they were measuring particulate matter PM 10, which is different, kind of a bigger particle. So we're focusing on a PM 2.5, there's been a 33% decline. Sulfur dioxide, which is a component of acid rain, 78% decline. And then nitrogen dioxide, 60%. And then ozone, 25%. I want to focus on ozone in particular because the EPA is going to be developing a new ozone standard. And it's going to cost a lot of money to a lot of people in this country. Ozone, when I refer to ozone, I'm referring to it as the pollutant, meaning the ground level ozone, not ozone layer. Ozone is a gas formed by nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. So in 1997, you had an ozone standard of 0.08 parts per million. So and what that meant was they would round it up. So if it was 0.084 parts per million, the county would still be meeting the standard. The current standard from 2008, so it's a relatively new standard, is 0.075 parts per million. All right, so now EPA EPA is going to be working on a new standard, but only 3 years after the 2008 standard, the Obama administration was already working on a new ozone standard. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA has to review the standards every 5 years, but they really kind of jumped the gun there. So in 2011, looked like they're about to release a new standard, and the recommendations were in the range of 0.06 parts per million to 0.07 parts per million. Now, the Obama administration actually withdrew the proposal. Just giving you an idea of what the cost would have been. If it was a 0.07 parts per million standard, cost would have been about up to $25 billion. If it was the 0.06 standard, far more stringent standard, $90 billion per year. That's serious money. Now what we did was we wanted to try to give an idea, provide some context of, is ozone getting better or getting worse? So one measure of that is to look at the number of high ozone days. And what we did was we looked at, so there's a period of time during the year that you have various monitors that measure ozone levels. And as you can see that the standard, the average number of national high ozone days across the country, we just took total number of monitors throughout the country, and then looked at how many violated the standard. And then you can see it's been a 75% decline since 1980. Now let's look at one of the worst counties, LA County. And what we did was we looked at the monitors. So each county has, some have one monitor, some counties don't have any monitors at all, but a lot of them have multiple monitors. So what we did was we took the average from the various monitors to get a real good picture of what the air quality is within that particular county. If you just look at one monitor and you just assume that one monitor represents the entire county, that's not really accurate. So what we did was, you can see we averaged the monitors across the county in LA since 1980, an 83% decline. Now here's some charts from the Congressional Research Service based on EPA data. These are the counties that would be violating the 0.08 parts per million standard. This is based on 2004 to 2006 data. So, okay, so this is the old standard. This is how many counties would have been in violation of the standard. Now we kind of go to the 0.075 parts per million, which is the current standard. This is how many counties would be in violation. And then, if we go to the stricter standard, 0.06, this is how many counties. So pretty much looks like almost all the counties. So what we did was we did our own analysis without the pretty maps yet, unfortunately. And we used 2010 and 2012 data to figure out what would happen with the ozone violations for all the counties. So we looked at 698 counties across the U.S., and those are the 698 counties that have one monitor measuring ozone. So at the old standard, you have 32 counties that violate the standard. The existing standard, you can see, is 216. And basically at 0.06, the most strict standard, which is possible, 93% of the counties would be in violation of the standard. So almost every county would be violating the standard. This is at the same time that actually air quality is getting much better. So you can see that if you know that air quality is getting better, but then all of a sudden you think, my God, the number of counties in violation have actually tripled, it gives you an impression that maybe air quality is actually getting worse, not better. And therein lies one of the big problems. One of the things also is every 5 years, there's this idea that you have to review the data and try to establish new standards, but a lot of these counties haven't even implemented the old standard yet. We don't even know to what extent the new standard is even working. And of course, when you review it every 5 years for something like ozone or particulate matter, it's just a given that they're going to make it stricter regardless, which is a problem. So, look, everybody wants clean air, but we certainly need to kind of dispel the myths when it comes to air quality. And I think you can see with all the 6 criteria pollutants are getting better with air, and certainly with ozone, which we're going to be discussing, and the public's going to be discussing a lot over the next year or two. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for your kind introduction. Somehow here I'm supposed to figure out how to. There is a way to do this. And I'm sure I'll figure it out here before long. Here we go.
You just go to the next slide on the presentation.
Oh, well, then get me back to, here we go. All right. Let me see. Let me cancel
How many
this.
lawyers does it take to correctly operate a computer, right?
Go to slideshow. Hang on.
There we go.
One of the beauties of my long history is that I'm not only an attorney, but I also have a PhD in environmental management. And I worked for EPA for 33 years, and there's, from time to time, contests where people ask the question, you know, if, this is classic, my daughter is trying to find a husband right now, God bless her. And so they have these wonderful questions that they ask, you know, like, if you were an animal, what animal would you be? And and so I often ask the question, if EPA was an animal, what would it be? And of course, the correct answer is it would be a snake. It would be a python, because a python, once it takes a bite, never lets go until it can get another bite. And so my discussion is to talk about where we really went off the rails a little bit, and I think how we can perhaps move forward, and to talk a little bit about land and water, and I mean very little. What we really need to do is to admit, as has been said already, that we've succeeded. There's no one single good measure for water quality, but there is a sort of general measure. Is the water impaired based on what the state said the quality of the water ought to look like? And so if you look at all the waters of the United States, and there's over 300,000 of them, sorry, there's over 300 million of them. I can't remember, being a lawyer and a scientist, sometimes those numbers can collide, but bottom line is most of them are not impaired. And those that are impaired for natural causes. You know, the deer have to go to the bathroom somewhere. And so when you look, and sometimes you can't even correct it, and I'm not going to go down that road, but let's put it this way, since George Washington tried to get to the House of Burgesses and couldn't because Accotink Creek was flooded, there's no reason to believe that EPA can now force Accotink Creek to be unflooded any more than George could at the time. Let's talk a little bit about land just briefly and say, let's look at agricultural land. My God, you know, all these farmers, their land's being taken, it's being developed. We're forcing these mega cities. Well, the reality is that agricultural property, cultivated acres, is going down, and the reason it's going down is because agricultural production is becoming more efficient. We're just better at growing the kinds of things we use the land to grow. And it's the problem that I think we have in our environmental community. Well, let me touch on the health welfare issue again. Emerson made this point: pirates and rebels were fathers of colonial settlement, and men will adopt sound policies once the frontier is settled and the ennobling influence of nature takes effect. Which is a nice way of saying, you know, when we get rich, we can fix that problem. And we have. I mean, we've come so far since 1970. But what have we not done? What have we failed to recognize we ought to be doing? And this is the small contribution I make today. The steward, and I've done a lot of study on stewardship, and not the kind of stewardship about making sure you have enough money in the church coffers to build the next set of pews. Stewardship goes back to the 12th dynasty of Egypt. The steward was essentially the land manager, didn't own it, but there's an interesting relationship there. Abraham's steward was his inheritor. The current High Steward of Scotland is the Prince of Wales. the inheritor, who will be the owner, is the best steward because they're the ones looking out for the future. But how do they look for it? They look for it in these two ways. They produce enough revenue off the estate, the state, the nation, the planet, take your pick, to ensure that it meets the needs of the estate. And if you think back in the 12th century, 13th century, you know, you wanted enough food to feed all the people that lived there, all of them, and to grow their ability to survive and survive well. But the steward had another duty, and that is to increase the value of the estate's assets. And that's all the assets, the human assets, the agriculture, the forestry, the woodlot, the streams and rivers and the fishing, the mining, yeah, all of it. That's what a steward's job is, do those two things. And you can still see that today. Go to a farm manager who doesn't own the farm, works for some distant, absent owner, and that farm manager will act under these same two principles exactly the same way, and you can actually find it in their contracts. So I want to take this concept and apply it to one example, just to give you a feel for what sad retired scientists think about. How would a steward clean up the Chesapeake Bay? Well, instead of thinking of it as a sink for pollution, and therefore we have to control pollution, let's think of it as it really is. It's a biological opportunity. The bay and the nutrients have to be viewed not as pollutants, but as nutrients that can alter the quality of that ecosystem, an ecosystem that can be very productive. So what are the two problems in the bay? There's a dead zone, and there's a limit of sustainable fish stocks. All right, we should care about that. And so if you look, that black area shows where the dead zone is each year. And so what can we do? Well, they're not a function of pollution of nitrogen and phosphorus levels alone. That's not what kills fish or causes. It's the algae. What kind of algae you have there? Okay, well, gosh, this guy's standing up here talking about algae. Well, let's talk about algae. There's good algae and there's bad algae. Blue-green algae is just like sort of a plant. It doesn't do much. It sucks up the nutrients. It dies, and when it dies, it consumes all the oxygen, decaying. That's bad algae. Diatoms, on the other hand, are food for phytoplankton, which are food for fish. And so before they die, they get eaten and incorporated into the corporal body of something else that gets eaten. I mean, we just had Easter. We know what corporal bodies are about right now, you know. We can resurrect the bay, and we do it by going after this. How do we do that? Well, as long ago as 1947, they studied the bay and said, hey, there are certain nutrient salts that count. All right, so a steward's looking at this going, are they there? Have we properly put what we need in place? And so here's the answer. And this was a paper that came out in 1980. Rather than considering treatment procedures which remove the nutrients and nitrogen and phosphorus from sewage, one might consider adding the things that are missing, silica and a little bit of iron. And in so doing, this would alter the receiving waters to a diatom, that's the good algae, and a consequent fertile and productive region. How productive could this be? It could increase the fish take sustainably from the Potomac by 10 times. That's what you can do by thinking like a steward. I'm sorry, my wife told me I shouldn't use glasses because it looks bad on TV. That's what you should do. You should think like a steward, and that's where we go from here. That allows us to say there are some things that maybe we should quit doing, and there are a couple that I would mention as I close. And that is, today maybe I'm a scientist, but I'm also a lawyer, and when I left the agency, someone asked me and said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to sue the agency. And they went, oh, no. And so we have, but one of the things I like to do is to petition the agency, and here's something we need to petition on. When the National Academy of Sciences was asked, what do we do about carcinogens, they said, well, we should consider the notion that there's no threshold of effect, that it's risky all the way to zero. But we've now shown that isn't true. There are just hundreds and hundreds of studies that shows this isn't true. Ed Calabrese has talked about this, and in fact, Myron has the article from Business Daily today about this. We want to petition them, and we will be petitioning them, to say, you need to go back and look at that. Because if you recognize that these very low doses are irrelevant or important to actually have, it completely changes the way you regulate. Completely. And so that's just one example of where we need to think more strategically with regard to what we ought to be doing and not just stay on this gravy train of trying to ration it down. And that'll be the new Earth Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So good afternoon. I'm Steve Malloy. I'm Director of External Policy and Strategy at Murray Energy Corporation. I'd like to thank Darren and Heritage for inviting me to speak today. Murray Energy is the largest privately held U.S. coal company and the third largest by sales. We have 7,300 employees who produce about 65 million tons of coal this year. Now today I'm going to talk about coal, not only because I'm in the coal industry now, but also because coal is ground zero in the environmental wars, and it's the most important battle that we're fighting today. The overarching eco-myth that I will debunk is the one about coal being a dirty form of energy that our country can do without. First, I'm going to talk about the need for coal and then discuss the wanton and reckless smearing and elimination of it. The coal industry helps generate about 40% of U.S. electricity. Coal makes the lowest cost and most reliable electricity. The coal industry, directly or indirectly, employs about 800,000 people, generates $50 billion in labor income, and contributes about $100 billion to GDP. Yet these impressive statistics don't somehow come close to doing justice to the benefits America and the world derive from the tremendous natural resource that is coal, of which we are blessed to have a several hundred-year supply. During last winter's polar vortex events, coal is what kept the lights on. When grid operators reached out to natural gas to meet increased demand for electricity, natural gas was either very expensive or even not there at all because of dramatic price spikes, pipeline failures, and even gas plant failures. Although sufficient and affordable coal power kept the grid afloat, grid failure was still only narrowly averted thanks to the Obama administration's war on coal, which has led to the shutdown of about 20% of U.S. coal power. As a result of the war on coal, during the first polar vortex event, we came within one 700-megawatt coal plant of a power failure, not something you want to have happen when temperatures are going well below zero. Already issued EPA rules will continue to close coal plants around the nation for the next couple of years. A little known or underappreciated reality is that utility giant American Electric Power said that during the January polar vortex event, it had to operate 89% of the plants it is being forced to shut down this coming year. When those plants are gone, what will happen to electricity reliability during the next polar vortex event or summer heat wave when electricity demand spikes are even greater? There are indirect effects and ironic effects of the Obama war against coal as well. California, which has banned coal-fired electricity, ironically could see brownouts and spiking electricity prices this summer because of the war on coal. As coal plants back east are being shuttered, demand for natural gas has increased, sending prices upwards. Drought-stricken, hydropower-dependent California will be forced to use more natural gas this summer. It's already in short supply in east, where it's being used to replace coal. This scenario is such a concern that the California grid operator warned that brownouts are a very real possibility this summer. At a congressional hearing on grid reliability last week, we learned from Mid-Atlantic grid operator PJM that coal-fired electricity is being replaced not by natural gas, but by something called demand response. What is demand response? Well, according to PJM, quote, demand response occurs when the grid operator decides to curtail customer use of electricity. For factories, this could mean temporarily halting a production line. For residential customers, this could mean having their air conditioners turned off. So coal is being replaced by brownouts. President Obama promised us transformation, and we are getting it. While governments around the world work to exploit their own coal resources, including China, India, Germany, UK, Japan, and even Bangladesh, here at home, the Obama administration is doing everything it can to destroy coal. From Obama's 2008 promise to bankrupt anyone who wanted to build a coal plant, to his January 2014 proposal to ban new coal plants, to the upcoming proposal to reduce emissions from existing coal plants, not to mention myriad other destructive regulatory actions in between and ongoing, Obama is conducting a systematic, ruthless, and senseless war against coal. Of the many guises of the war on coal, global warming is perhaps the most used excuse. While I will leave out most of the discussion of global warming junk science, I want you to keep this in mind. Simple math shows that the Obama war on coal for purposes of climate control is futile. Even if U.S. CO2 emissions stopped today and were to be zero for the remainder of the century, atmospheric CO2 levels would only decrease by about 3%. There would be no measurable impact on global climate at a cost of 25% of global GDP. We can debate the science of global warming to our heart's content, and we should, but the reality is worldwide hydrocarbon use is increasing. By itself, China is adding the equivalent of the entire U.S. coal fleet between now and 2020. India is adding 71 gigawatts of coal power between now and 2018, almost as much as the Obama EPA has already shuttered. So Obama's unilateral actions are all based on junk science and will accomplish nothing except hurt our standard of living, devastate coal communities, raise electricity prices for all, and cause power outages. Perhaps the most underappreciated aspect to the war on coal is the insidious and false claim that coal pollutes the air with fine particulate matter that kills tens of thousands of people every year. By reducing particulate emissions, EPA claims thousands of lives are saved annually. Former EPA Chief Lisa Jackson testified in Congress that 1 out of 4 deaths in America is caused by particulate matter. EPA says there is no safe exposure to particulate matter and that any exposure can cause death within hours of inhalation. These claims are patently false and are proven so every day, yet they serve as the basis for EPA rules that are scheduled to shut down 20% of U.S. coal power by 2016. These claims will be used by the EPA again when it proposes to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from existing coal plants, rules that will shut down even more coal power. It is quite ironic that reducing global warming will not be the actual reasoning EPA relies upon for its global warming rules aimed at coal plants. Instead, EPA will claim that virtually all the benefits of its global warming rules will be derived from alleged improvements in air quality, not reductions in atmospheric CO2. The junk science myth that EPA's anti-coal rules save lives has given rise to corresponding junk economic myths. First, EPA values each hypothetical life saved at about $9 million, even if you are 100 years old. Then, EPA goes on to claim that by preventing thousands of premature deaths every year, its rules supposedly provide health benefits worth tens of billions of dollars annually. In 2011, EPA claimed that just 2 of its anti-coal rules would provide health benefits worth as much as 2.5% of GDP. Now, just think about that for a minute. Simply by issuing 2 regulations, EPA claimed to have added 2.5% to GDP. So EPA fancies itself as the goose that lays golden eggs in the form of regulations. EPA's abusive mindset seems to be, the more we do to you, the less you seem willing to believe that we are doing it to you. Just last week, a federal appellate court ruled in favor of one of the EPA's anti-coal rules, noting that EPA's estimated benefits, amounting to $90 billion, is nine times greater than the rule's estimated $10 billion in costs. The judges were never told, however, that while the $10 billion in costs is based on real-world experience and expectation, the $90 billion in alleged health benefits are an entirely made-up EPA fantasy. The real-world benefits of the rule are likely zero, and $10 billion in real costs is greater than $0 in imaginary benefits. The cynicism of Obama's war on coal is amply demonstrated by the EPA's recent proposal requiring new coal plants to spend billions of dollars installing technology to capture CO2 emissions. Oddly enough, the EPA rule will not require coal plants to actually use this costly technology. It only has to be installed. That's because EPA hasn't figured out yet what to do with the captured CO2. And it probably won't be able to, since storing CO2 on a utility scale is physically, financially, and politically impossible. So what is the point of EPA's carbon capture proposal, the first to be issued under the so-called Obama Climate Action Plan? Well, the point is to make new coal plants so costly to build that it would bankrupt anyone who wanted to build one. Now, where did we hear that before? EPA has repeatedly told Congress that captured CO2 could be used to help produce hard-to-get-at oil. The process is called enhanced oil recovery. What the Obama EPA hasn't told anyone yet is that CO2 emissions produced by burning the recovered oil are greater than the CO2 emissions stored from the power plants. EPA's proposal would actually increase CO2 emissions. The Obama EPA proposal clearly flies in the face of the Supreme Court decision that allowed EPA to regulate CO2 in the first place. Responding to the argument that reducing CO2 emissions from U.S. cars would not solve the global warming problem, the court noted that EPA didn't have to solve the global warming problem all at once. Incremental progress was acceptable. So how would the liberal justices and Justice Anthony Kennedy feel about EPA issuing rules that actually increase CO2 emissions? Does that qualify as incremental progress? At the recent congressional hearing on grid reliability, we learned that the polar vortex has awakened at least some utilities and grid operators to the reality that coal is an essential part of our fuel mix. But this may not be happening fast enough as the Obama administration undertakes a mad dash to do as much damage as possible before it leaves office. EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy admitted to Congress that EPA's efforts against the coal industry would provide no benefit to the climate. In fact, the purpose of EPA's actions, she testified, is merely to make the Obama administration look good at the 2015 climate treaty negotiations in Paris. Now, I suppose one wouldn't have to travel as far as Paris to look good after pointlessly destroying coal. You certainly couldn't do it in Wheeling, West Virginia. The State Department recently informed the United Nations that the Obama administration doesn't even believe the U.S. Senate must ratify any climate treaty Obama may sign. But I suppose the coal industry will just have to stand in line with everyone else when it comes to complaining about this administration's failure to follow the law. Of course, everyone in that line will need electricity, so we might want to prioritize. Global warming alarmists would have us believe that the main danger to be faced in the future is bad weather, which somehow, possibly, may or may not be affected by man-made CO2 emissions. My own view is that arbitrary and punitive government fueled by eco-myths, junk science, and junk economics is a much larger threat. We will survive the bad weather, but I wonder how much rogue government we can take. Thank you.
All right, so now we have time for you all to join the program as well with any questions. I may just ask one to start off with. Darren, you talked a lot about the counties being in non-attainment basically for ozone. Can you or does anybody else on the panel want to talk about what the consequences of that are for those local counties?
David should explain what he would do if he were EPA to those counties.
Well, let me give you an example that is not ozone related but similar. Mm-hmm. Under the Clean Water Act, they're trying to reduce the amount of sediment that goes into rivers. And most of the sediment that falls down in the bottom of the rivers that kills those bottom of the food chain comes from the stream itself because there's a lot of water. The cost of attempting to make the change that EPA thought for Fairfax County was greater than the operating budget of Fairfax County. Okay, and this is the wealthiest county in the country on a per capita basis. And so when you talk about what this could do, I'll give you one other quick example. We were trying to figure out how to clean up one stream bed and secure it from undercutting a road. The stream went like this, the road was next to it, and it was undercutting the road. It cost $86,000 to do an engineering study to figure out that you had to dump a load of rocks next to it to keep it from doing that. And I shared that with a colleague of mine from Augusta County, Virginia. And he says, heck, that's the entire county budget, and I don't need that much money to go out with a pair of dirty boots and figure out where to dump rock. And so that's the problem we have. It doesn't matter whether it's ozone or water or solid waste. The reality is that the population centers of this country are liberal, and they think they can spend as much as they want for as long as they want. And I don't know when that's going to end.
Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, I think one of the things that America has to come to grips with, and you're not going to get it from mainstream environmentalists, is that American air is clean and safe. Okay, there's nobody suffering any health effects or dying, much less dying, from ambient air in America. One of the last things I did before I left junk science was we got a bunch of hospital asthma admissions data from the University of California Davis Health System. So for 2010 to 2012, I believe we had 19,000 hospital admissions, and we compared them with ozone level, daily ozone levels and daily hospital admissions, and there's no association. And this is consistent with all the research and all the modern research on associations between ozone or particulate matter and asthma or death, which are the two main health effects that EPA is clamoring about. EPA's got this cabal of scientists. It pays them to do the research, then it pays them to review their own work. And this is how EPA comes up with these scary numbers about how American air is, even though it's cleaner than ever, it's more dangerous than ever.
All right.
I would just add,
Yeah.
Asthma rates getting a lot worse, while air quality is getting a lot better. The emissions data, the hospital emissions data, the studies seem to support exactly what Steve said. So there's certainly no correlation. And the problem is, a lot of times with environmental policy, the agencies focus on reduction in emissions or even reduction in concentration levels, theoretically. But the point is, that's the means to achieving an end. So if the goal of reducing ozone is to try to improve the health of Americans because of asthma or whatever it might be, then look at what the impact is on asthma. And the problem is they aren't able to do that. They don't go back and see what impact has stricter standards actually had on reducing asthma rates. Instead, they just talk about what they think would actually, that asthma would get better and there'd be less emissions of people in hospitals, but it's just not supported. So even with like CO2, we talk a lot about how CO2 emissions will be, we should have a target of less CO2 emissions or less concentration of CO2. But what is the goal when it comes to CO2 emissions? It's to try to have an impact on temperature. That's the bottom line when it comes to global warming. But anything you pretty much can do, if you cut out all CO2 emissions, you're really not going to have any measurable impact on global temperature. And it comes down to focusing on what the goal is. And what happens is the means winds up being the goal, and people don't take a step back to think about what the actual goal is.
That's right.
Okay, we have time for questions. I just asked if you'd wait for a microphone because we are being recorded for online, and then if you have a affiliation, please let us know that as well. And we'll start there in the back.
Thank you. I'm Dino Drury. I'm an economist, but with no particular affiliation. But the question I have for you, the last speaker, is how complicit are the power companies with this? Because they can always hide behind, oh, we have to blah, 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 so we have to jack the rates up through the ceiling, etc. It seems to me if they were to just have some brownouts, buy some advertising to blame it on the EPA, that would be in short order the end of it.
Well, I don't want to criticize my customers, but I will say that power companies are a different sort of animal. They will charge what the government allows them to charge, and government generally allows them to charge what they need to charge to stay in business. So, and they work closely with the government. So it's not, they're not like us. We don't work for the government. We're a real business, and most of the fossil fuel business is like that. But utilities are sort of they're like railroads. They're highly regulated, so they have a completely different perspective on the world.
Let me share with you an event that actually happened. We sued the state of Colorado over its renewable energy standard. And the problem is, the rest of you lawyers in the room know, is that you have to get standing. You have to have somebody to represent, which is always a challenge if you're trying to do strategic litigation, because a lot of people don't want to be part of a lawsuit. And this is especially true for electric companies. So we went to Colorado and looked for the guys who were going to be most harmed and said, hey, you should be on our side. And they went, oh, we are. And we went, great. So will you be a plaintiff? Who went over our dead body. And there's one company, I won't name who it is, but you can figure it out if you ever read the legislative acts of Colorado, who I would have saved $2 billion for over a 5-year period. And they didn't want to support the effort because they were afraid of the Public Utility Commission and the legislature. And after we sued, the legislature was convinced these guys were the guys funding us. They weren't, but they were convinced they were, and so they changed the law to just really put a bad hurting on that company, one company. And so I would ask you to do this. As an economist, you should do this anyway. Go to look at the boardrooms of electric utility commissions and compare them with, for example, the boardroom of a real business, and find out which one of them has the marble floors and the walnut the walnut walls, because that's all paid for out of what these guys can extract in the way of rents.
Could I add to this a bit? One of the key things is that the states that are pushing renewable portfolio standards, California is the best example, they have arranged so that the utilities get a guaranteed rate of return even as they produce less electricity for their consumers. As rates go up, consumers have to use less electricity, but they're guaranteed to get a percentage of a higher rate. So actually, in many states, the electric utilities are benefiting from higher electric rates and lower consumption. And that is diabolical.
It's even worse. If you're a wind producer in California and they need to release water from the hydro dams for the fish, which means that they're making electricity, which means that they don't need the wind power, you still get paid as a wind power generator, even if you don't produce a single kilowatt. And what's more important is you get paid at a higher rate because that's what they negotiated for.
And if I just one more thing, it's important to keep in perspective. Utilities basically make more money. But the old model was make more money, the more power you sell. And power, you used to sell more power when the economy's growing. Of course, in the last 6 years, our economy has been in the toilet, and so they've had to adopt models like Myron's talking about. They are more reliant on the government now. They are willing to sell their souls for that. But if you look at the presentations of utility CEOs. They do, and just there was a hearing in Congress 2 weeks ago with some utility CEOs. They do bemoan the fact that the economy is not growing. It doesn't look like it's going to grow anytime soon, and that means there's not going to be more power used. And this is a real problem. I mean, they're hoping for some sort of manufacturing renaissance in the Midwest with all the shale gas there, but that has not materialized yet.
Another question here in the back row.
My name is Jeff Mitchell. I'm an attorney of no particular affiliation, but there was an article last week that the Chinese government had released a study actually acknowledging that 20% of their agricultural productive land had been poisoned. To what extent, we're taking a victory lap a little bit here about the pollution, reduction gains we've made in the U.S. over the last, 30 years, 40 years. To what extent have our environmental rules simply move the production of pollution and for all the goods that we consume to places like China?
No, look, every country goes through the same process, which is it's poor, and it has poor environmental quality, and as it gets wealthier, people start to complain about it and say, we now are rich enough to do something about it. Well, China is lagging in that curve because they have a communist dictatorship government that is not as accountable to the people as some other countries. But they're going to go through the same thing. And I doubt that I think that number, I doubt that study has a lot of validity. But sure, they have poisoned their streams, their air, and their soil. But as they become wealthier, even in a communist dictatorship with a somewhat free market economy, the people are going to say, hey, we have to clean this up. And so it will happen. Somebody told me some years ago that Beijing in circa 2000 had air quality similar, and of course it's gotten worse since 2000, but had air quality similar to New York City in the 1950s. So it doesn't take that long to clean it up, and they will.
To answer your question directly, though, for example, the rare earths mining and manufacturing has moved almost exclusively to China. And they've destroyed a lake, an entire community. They've poisoned the land to a point where, frankly, I don't think they can clean it up. I think it is condemned forever. I mean, until geologic time, that kind of time. And so has some of this moved over? Well, when the cost of production is smaller in another place because they don't have to do this, sure, that's going to happen. But I agree with Myron. It's exactly what Emerson said. Once you get past the rapacious value of pirates and you finally get to a point of where you create real wealth, people will want to come back to that. We're all environmentalists, and we always have been.
And if I could just give you a quick coal industry sort of perspective on this. Everyone's blaming China's bad air on all the coal burning that goes Well, in fact, if there was more coal burning, more modern coal power burning in China, the air would be a lot cleaner. The air problem in China is because a lot of it's traffic, and the other part of it is due to there's a lot of residential heating with coal and cooking with coal, and so that's stuff they just put it in a stove, fire it up, and everything goes right out the chimney. Now, if they had electricity, coal-fired electricity, if they had gas-fired electricity, if they had nuclear, if they had more power supply that they could use to cook and heat their homes, the air would be a lot cleaner. They still have a car problem, but it's important to know what's actually causing the problem. And we read these statistics in the newspaper and see pictures every day. I really encourage you to ask the next question. Well, is this really true? And how do I know it's true? Where do they get their facts from? You just you really can't read mainstream media and just I'm preaching to the choir here.
All right, we have time maybe for one more. Any other questions for our panelists? Yep, we got one back here.
Myron, can you bring us up to date on the litigation involving the endangerment finding, and where's that going at this point? Isn't that a CEI?
It's still at the Supreme Court. The arguments have been made. So I would add to that, though, for those of you who are looking for more Earth Day events, I said that the only one I could find in D.C. was at Union Station at NASA, but the Secretary of Energy, and Ernest Moniz, and the EPA Administrator, Regina McCarthy, are in Boston today, and if you have access to the Major League Baseball Network, they are together throwing out the first ball at Fenway Park tonight as part of the Earth Day celebration. So that's so.
I would say one thing, because I think it's valuable to understand. The one thing the Supreme Court chose not to take up was the quality of the underlying science used in the endangerment finding. And so the technical legal question that they're going to take up will be interesting and will have some effect. But in fact, I believe that it is now time to go back to EPA, petition them to review the endangerment finding based on all the new information that's available.
All right, well, I think we've had a very interesting conversation here. Please join me in thanking our guests, and thank you for coming.